Although the first Porsche motor car wasn't sold until 1949, the Porsche name had been famous throughout the 20th century. Dr. Porsche started by designing electric cars in Austria, but his most famous exploit in the 1930s was to be the designer of the world-famous VW Beetle. During the war, VW had spent its time building military vehicles. The factory had then been flattened by the Allied air forces, and in 1945, Dr. Porsche himself was quite unfairly put in jail. His son Ferry gathered the remnants of the workforce around him, went back to the family estate in Austria, and set about literally designing anything that would pay the bills. By about the end of 1948, there was enough time to sit down and design the sports car they'd always promised they would build for themselves. Now, Porsche was a small company with little money behind them. They said to themselves, fine, we want to make a motor car with our own Porsche badge on it, but it must be based on the Beetle. The result was what they called Project 356, and this is where the name of the original, very famous rear-engine Porsche came from.
Well, I originally had Lotuses and new ones, but they kept breaking down and I got very disenchanted with them. A friend of mine lent me a 356 Cabriolet to go up to the British Grand Prix in 1978 at Silverstone. And it was wonderful. We had two small kids and we slotted them into the back in their Peter Storm suits. And we drove it up with the top down, even though it's quite cold. And it was just wonderful. And I fell in love with it. So I looked out for a 356, specifically a Cabriolet, and I found one in Exchange and Mart in London, and went and had a look at it. It had been snowing, the top was torn, and the back was all full of snow, but I thought, yes, this is it. So I bought it.
In many ways, the 356 was a very advanced car for its period. Most sports cars still had front engines driving the rear wheels. Most sports cars were still open to the elements. Here was something new. The engine was behind the rear wheels, so the traction was phenomenal. The body style was very advanced. That car never went anywhere near a wind tunnel, but it was a very wind-cheating body. They got the shape right straight away. Not cheap to buy, but very efficient car with a reliable, high-geared engine. For the amount of power it had, it was quite phenomenally fast.
Well, the Cabriolet, of course, has just got the ordinary 1600cc pushrod engine, very reliable, air-cooled, flat 4, maintain it once a year, change the oil, it'll go on for hundreds of thousands of miles, very reliable. The Carrera 2 engine is very specialised, it's got 4 overhead camshafts, all bevel gear and shaft driven, very complicated, very expensive engine. You've really got to look after it. It's almost like a racing car on the road. You've got to check it regularly, service it regularly. You tend to listen for every little noise, get a bit paranoid, and you've got to have a big bank balance. They were very expensive in their day, and so only people with quite a lot of money could afford them. And they tended just to zoom off in them, didn't look after them very well, and you used to find that they would do about 25,000 miles and then the engine would go wrong. It'd be taken out of the car, taken apart, and then they'd find out how much it cost to repair. So they thought, oh, we don't like this, so they'd sell the car on with the engine in pieces, and the next owner would go through the same scenario. He'd find out how much it would cost. So it would change hands 3 or 4 times with the engine in pieces. So you usually find that Carrera 2s have done a very low mileage. To drive the Cabriolet on a day like this is wonderful. Top down, wind in your hair, what little you've got. It's great, absolutely great.
Early Porsche material was comparatively flimsy. You knew the kind of car you were buying in advance, you didn't bother with expensive brochures, and indeed the company couldn't afford to produce such materials. The 1950s materials were generally single sheets in one colour, And if you were comparing a Jaguar with a Porsche, you were paying twice the money for a Porsche, so you had to make a very definite and deliberate decision, and you weren't likely to be influenced by sales literature. You were influenced by its pedigree and its reputation.
Occasionally you get the thing, oh, is it a Beetle? Which is definitely the wrong thing to say. They're both rear-engined, they're both air-cooled. In fact, early 356s used a lot of the same components, same engine, same suspension.
By the end of the 1950s, the 356 had shed almost all its old Beetle heritage. Part by part, new Porsche pieces had arrived. Porsche then spent a lot of time looking for a new generation motor car. The result was a motor car evolving in the early 1960s, which started a new series of car, much bigger, much more powerful, and if you like, the start of a completely new generation of Porsches.
There was a bit of a stir at Porsche. The French car makers Peugeot raised an objection to the model designation 901, claiming that any combination of 3 digits with a naught in the middle was theirs, protected by patent. Porsche reacted promptly, and from then on the new sports car was marketed around the world as the Porsche 911.
When the world saw the 911 in 1963, most observers said that they could see where the heritage came from. The styling cues, the shape, the low nose, the long fastback, even the noise of the 911 was similar. It was the son of in so many ways. It was technologically quite a lot more advanced than the 356. Unfortunately, that meant that it was going to be expensive as well. But Porsche knew that he could more or less name his price for a car of this character. The Americans in particular were fighting for it, and from the word go, there was always a big queue.
This is a 1973 911 2.7 RS Carrera. I've had early 911s and they're production models. This particular version was developed for racing purposes, but they had to make 500 production models in order to qualify it for homologation to Group 4 for the GT series. They designed the car from the outset to be as light as possible, so very little undersill was applied to the car. They made the car lighter by using thinner gauge metal. It was 0.8mm thick instead of 0.88mm. They then further lightened the car by using thin material for the carpets, lighter seats. They used thinner glass as well. This endowed the homologation car with a weight of less than 900 kilograms. The marketing department were worried that they wouldn't sell the first 500 cars. Who would want a car without any undersill and Spartan interior? So they offered the touring spec, which is basically the luxury items from the then production car at the time. This meant that the car was driven straight off the production line down to the Stuttgart city weighing station and then brought back, and all the lightweight bumper and trim and so forth was removed from the car, and the car was then finished as per the customer's specification to touring spec.
In the 60s and 70s, Porsche were much more confident in their marketing. The cars were presented in much more expensive, lavish brochures. They were shown with glamorous women. Porsche were actually concentrating on the executive sophistication of their buyers, not their interest in sports cars.
Early 911s are a total driving sensation. They were built with few compromises, a quick spurt down the road, 100 metres, and it's like swallowing a bucket full of adrenaline. And it's like having a fix. Each time it's a new sensation and a new experience. I just love driving it. The car isn't just a high-performance sports car. The design is also extremely attractive to look at, and probably this model, 73 RS, with its purposeful lines, is probably the most beautiful of them all. The colour especially is a very rare colour. There are 11 cars in total produced in this colour and only one in right-hand drive. The rest went to Europe and one went to Mexico. As I'm driving along the road, especially with the younger people, I get them standing by the roadside giving me the thumbs up at the colour of the car. When I get old and senile and in about 30 or 40 years' time, and have a large house, perhaps the RS will take pride of place in a room in the house. It's certainly an art form, and one gets pleasure just from looking at the car without even driving it.
Once the 911 went on sale in 1964, it was clear that Porsche had a long-term plan for this car. By the early 1970s, the engineers were so confident of the car that they turbocharged the engine, produced phenomenal outputs, and sent the motor car out to win sports car races outright all over the world.
In the late 60s and early 70s, Porsche were extremely successful with racing turbocharged cars, so they decided to put a turbocharger onto a production car. This car is a 1975 930 Turbo 3-litre. It's a 930 because when Porsche developed this car, they actually wanted to identify it as a separate car from the 911 family. This car was actually probably one of the first full-time production cars in the world to actually run a successful and reliable turbocharged system. With the extra horsepower, they needed to put wider tyres on, and they had to then, to incorporate these larger tyres, they had to put larger wings on. I like the styling of this car because it's fat. It's nice and chunky at the back. It's got extremely wide arches. It looks low, it looks meaningful, it looks rather sexy. And this car is squat and purposeful looking. The car is definitely a design icon. It's the recognised sports car in the world. Like Ferrari as a name, Porsche is a distinctive shape. In 1975, I bought a copy of Car magazine that ran a road test on the Ferrari Berlinetta Boxer, Lamborghini Countach and the Porsche 3-litre Turbo. And I sat there reading this article over and over again and realising that although the other two were extremely glamorous cars, the car for me was a 3-litre Turbo. It was silver, like the one I've got, and it was just the one for me. I loved the lines, I loved the actual car. It was small, compact, well designed, well engineered. We didn't know in 1975 that it was still going to be around today, but good Lord, here it is. And I've got one of the early ones, one of the first 3-litre turbos, number 58. It's in the family forever, much to the discretion of my wife, but it will always be with us. It's a family heirloom. It deserves to be looked after now. She's 21 years old, she's had a lot of history, and she's got a lot of more history to come. So when I'm driving the car, I'm like a kid with a new toy, and I can't wipe the grin off my face for a couple of hours afterwards because there's such a thrill out of it. So the engine's in the wrong place, and it's very hard to master. But once you get something right, it's fantastic. It really does feed back through the wheel, through the steering and the suspension, that you're doing the right thing or the wrong thing. The Porsche 911 fits into two categories of supercar and everyday transport in terms of the reliability factor. You know that this car's never going to let you down. Whereas other supercars we know can be temperamental, can be extremely unreliable, and you know that at the end of the day when you get in this car it will take you from A to B and A to Z. It really doesn't matter.
Times were changing. There were critics who said sports cars should not have engines at the rear anymore, they should have engines at the front. The early 1970s, Porsche began a sea change of design. The 911, by their standards, became unfashionable, and behind closed doors in Stuttgart, a totally new generation of Porsche began to take shape. Porsche had a contract to design a new sports car for VW. Unhappily, VW cancelled that car at an advanced stage. Porsche took it up and in 1976 launched a motor car we now know as the Porsche 924. This was totally different from the 911 and in fact was made in a different factory. The engine was basically an Audi engine, it had water cooling, it was at the front and it drove the back wheels. But this, if only we'd known it, was the start of a new generation of sports coupes from Porsche.
The 924 was designed to be a low-end vehicle for more practical use, more day-to-day use if you like. It was there to supplement the 911s. The 944 took the original design of the 924, which is still a very successful and very desirable car, and put it into a pure Porsche format. It's Porsche's own engine, running gear, bodywork, the whole bit. This is a Porsche 944 Lux, 1983. One of the earlier models. It's original. Keep it really. She's done quite a few miles. She's a very reliable car, and I love it dearly. Not quite as much as my wife to be, but I love it dearly. I bought the car 4 or 5 years ago for £5,100, which is nothing for a top mark car. It's the Martini car. Anytime, any place, anywhere. It is equally at home doing short trips as it is doing long trips, and it's equally as usable. These cars are animals to drive. They are hysterical when people out of a family saloon and think they'll get into a car and just drive it off. It's not difficult to handle, it's just you've got to concentrate a little bit more. They are designed to be driven by people who know how to drive sports cars, or by people who want to genuinely learn how to drive sports cars. They're beautifully balanced. You can throw them around the road and know that you've actually got 4 good corners on the road all the time. Very safe, very slick, very tight. I think even today, the Porsche is still a dream car for a lot of people. I don't think a lot of people actually realise how affordable some of these cars are. Yes, it did have a big image in the 80s of the successful person up in the city, the country toy, if you like, or the Sunday car. But if you take that away from it, they are still one of the most practical and affordable everyday cars you can have, especially the 24s and the 44s. One evening down at our local pub, just down the road from here, I met somebody who was interested in the car. We started talking as you do, and one thing has led to another. We went out for a number of occasions, we took the car out for a run, and a friendship that started off as a friendship has now become a little bit more permanent. She's now my fiancée, and she has a very active interest in the car, which is nice because she's building up with it. She did the last service on the car and it's still running. The engine's in the front, the water's in it. Some people call them kettles. I'm a water-cooled Porsche lover. I find people who actually look at the cars and say they're pretend Porsches or they're not real ones either have a certain jealous streak in them where they really would like to have one but couldn't afford it, or they're actually 911 owners who've actually got the nice car and feel what if it was a cheeky upstarts. I always turn around to them and say, well, it's great because I've got a heater that works.
During the 80s, as we might call yuppie boom came along, both in Europe and in North America. The result was that a new development program for the 911 was started up, and towards the end of the 1980s, a new generation of 911s came along. Everything connected with that motor car was studied again by the engineers. New engines, new suspension, and even styling changes.
Porsche in the 90s suffered from the yuppie image of the 80s and therefore almost had to remarket themselves. The first thing they did was to get rid of ostentatious brochures, which seemed to present glamour and seemed to present conspicuous consumption. And they replaced them with very discreet little booklets, which presented serious information to buyers who were intelligent, thoughtful, and who were not conspicuous consumers.
For the late 1990s, Porsche seems to have abandoned front-engine cars, and it seems to have abandoned water-cooled engine cars almost entirely. The 911 is going to be replaced fairly soon, but I'm told that all enthusiasts will recognise the replacement when it comes along. There's also to be a new generation of open car called the Boxster, which is very new. This, again, will use developments of the famous flat-six engine.
If you cut me in half, yes, you probably would find the words Porsche written through my body. It's a love affair, not just with the marque, but all the people associated with it.
Well, Porsche to me means a well-engineered car, excellent build quality.
Some people's reactions are quite mixed, really. Some people don't like letting you out at junctions. Young boys look and stare and point and go, wow, look at that. And other people just look, ooh, another chap in a Porsche. But at the end of the day, I don't really care because I'm an enthusiast. I bought the car because of what it is, not because of what I think I am.